Welcome to Spiritual Psychology. My name's Renee McKenna, and I bring my 30-plus years as a recovering addict and ex-crazy person turned therapist and shamanic healer to bring you snackable teachings on spirituality, psychology, and all things personal growth. And today I want to talk about making friends with trauma. That might sound like a crazy or even impossible idea if you struggle, like many people do, with the present-day effects of past abuse, neglect, injury, or tragedy. But my personal experience and my trauma work with clients these last 20 years has proven to me that bringing compassion, understanding, and a present-centered awareness of the parts of us that are most wounded is a fast track to healing and the most transformative work we can do. In fact, the bulk of my work with clients these past 20 plus years has been helping people heal their relationships with the wounded parts of themselves. And the roots of most unresolved emotional issues and mental dysfunction could be seen as unresolved trauma. Trauma is the Greek word for wound, and the word trauma is still used today in medical circles referring to physical injury. A head trauma for an accident. When my daughter broke her arm, they talked about trauma to her elbow and growth plate. So trauma refers to some kind of damage. And from an emotional, psychological, mental, or spiritual aspect, the idea of wound or injury totally applies. Generally, physical trauma is pretty easy to see and recognize. If you have an injury to a bone, a joint, a muscle, or your skin, there's all kinds of signs and symptoms that are pretty hard to ignore. Swelling, bleeding, lots of pain, all a very well-designed system to let us know something's really wrong. We need to pay attention. The body's trying to bring all of its healing resources to the physical issue. And the same is true with non-physical injuries as well. That there is a natural healing function that's set up to really get our attention. Some of the common symptoms of emotional or psychological trauma, like anxiety, depression, emotional suffering, are the psyche's attempts to heal itself, which I see very similarly in swelling and pain in the body. And just like a physical injury will often need a lot of extra help to be able to heal itself, we might need stitches, we might need to have a bone set or casted if it's broken. We might even need to have surgery. Now, those interventions don't actually heal the wound. What they do is they set up the optimal situation for that natural healing process to happen. And that's what good therapy and good personal growth work does. Helps us clean the wound and stitch it up so that the wisdom of our body, mind, spirit complex can do its evolutionary work. We may need to grow scar tissue or new bone mass. We may need to learn to walk with a psychic prosthetic. I spent some time last weekend with a friend who lost his leg in a motorcycle accident, an event which completely redirected and reorganized his life. From this standpoint, I would say in a positive way. And in a kind of amazing serendipity, he happened to work in the prosthetic industry. Prosthetics are the fake limbs that you get after you lose something. And he was tapped into the newest equipment you could get. And that really intense experience continues to inform his life in some really profound and positive ways. He's become somewhat of an expert in blending herbs and medicines, both kind of standard and non-traditional, in order to manage his pain and his own residual trauma. He's kind of a self-taught expert in microdosing and is quite generous in sharing his knowledge and resources with others. I'm reminded of my friend MJ back in Boston. She had some kind of a career that she wasn't terribly happy in, but she was making decent money, and although she was unhappy, she didn't feel like she had a good enough reason to get out. And then she had a terrible car crash. Really messed up her back. And the pain med thing didn't work very well for her, so she started to do yoga and massage. And the massage was so helpful for her, she became a massage therapist and ultimately opened a chain of therapeutic massage studios. And one of the most important things we can do in facing and healing trauma is to accept that it actually happened. Life can be extremely difficult, and it often presents us with things that we don't want to have happen. No one wants to be raped or abused, neglected, or lose their leg. But when we submit ourselves to these experiences, surrender to what has happened, and the process of healing, our unique life experience can be incredibly guiding and informative, even empowering. And the whole process of making friends with our trauma is a deeply character-building experience in itself. So there are three main types of trauma: acute, chronic, and complex. An acute trauma results from a single incident, like an accident, an attack, or some other one-time event. Chronic trauma is usually repeated and prolonged, like domestic violence, neglect, or physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. Complex trauma is when there's multiple traumatic events. So, for example, I know a young man whose brother was murdered. His father died on the street of alcoholism, and his mother was very violent with him as a child. But regardless of the type of trauma, from my perspective, the treatment is the same. Doing what we can to accept and process what happened in the past and truly put it into the past, and reclaiming the traumatized parts of ourselves, making friends with them, taking responsibility for them, and bringing love, compassion, and integration of the wounded parts of ourselves into present time so that they can heal. From a psycho-spiritual perspective, not every difficult, tragic, or horrific thing that happens to a person causes trauma. There are many veterans who return from war without post-traumatic stress disorder. This doesn't mean they're unaffected or unchanged by the experience, but trauma is something different. And PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, means that a traumatic event remains stressful after it has happened, for months, years, even decades. And I often refer to emotional, mental, spiritual processing of our life experience as a form of digestion. And we could look at PTSD almost like a bowel obstruction, that for whatever reasons are particular to the individual, they're unable to digest their experience, to take the nutrients out of it and to excrete the rest. Digestion takes food and turns it into energy, fat, and waste, basically. And processing our life experience could be seen similarly, that we take what's important, necessary, or informative out of an experience and let go of what doesn't serve us. And processing an experience does not mean that we live through it again. We already lived through it once. There's nothing helpful about re-experiencing it. But the way I understand trauma through this lens of processing or digestion, that what causes trauma is an inability to be able to process the experience. And it's totally understandable. To be physically, emotionally, or sexually abused can be extremely confusing. We don't have a shelf to put that on in our internal filing system. Unexpected violence or death, loss, illness can be shocking and disorienting. Birth trauma is extremely common for both the baby and the mother, generally unrecognized. Having birthed two babies in different ways, it is no joke, is a life and death situation. And the way I understand trauma is that the parts of ourself that don't know how to process, cope with, or digest whatever the circumstance is, kind of get split off from the rest of ourself, like Rapunzel being put up in a tower. I like the metaphor of a pearl being formed in an oyster when an irritant gets inside the shell to protect itself. And the parts or aspects of ourself that are traumatized kind of get frozen in psychological time. And it's kind of a brilliant mechanism that allows us to function and maybe not go crazy at the time. But if we don't reintegrate the traumatized parts of ourselves, they remain in perpetual suffering. And the way I understand anxiety, depression, Flashbacks, intrusive dreams that a lot of people suffer with, or how they become aware that there's unresolved trauma, are these aspects of our own soul energy trying to get back home. And because we often didn't know how to manage the circumstance in the first place, it's very natural that we would want to avoid those parts of ourselves. But just like if you have a cut that needs stitches, the last thing you think you'd want to do is poke at it, but it's actually the thing we need to do. Pain, suffering get our attention. And so, how do we make friends with our trauma? In my work, I find it invaluable to make grounded, compassionate, and wise spiritual connection first, however you understand that. The beauty and power of nature is an excellent place to start. And then to make room for the feelings that are coming up, which are a direct portal to the traumatized parts of ourselves. And I find the active imagination, which kind of looks like a guided meditation, to be an amazingly simple and helpful tool. And the point is to bring the wounded parts of ourselves into present time and out of that kind of frozen place in psychological time, and to heal our relationship with ourself. Because whether we're aware of it or not, we do have the power to heal ourself. And the disassociation, the neglect, the avoidance, the abandonment of these vulnerable parts of ourselves, understandable as it is actually where the change and healing need to happen. The power of love, compassion, understanding, acceptance are immeasurable. So, for example, I did a session with a client this week who was sexually abused as a young child. And he's done different layers of work around this, but it started to come up for him in a whole new way, with intrusive dreams and some panic, and he's been really suffering. And so I asked him, where does he experience the trauma in his body? And it was in his belly. And we brought some active imagination to the sensations in his belly, and it presented as kind of a bag of mucousy bile. And we moved that energy out of his body, and it personified as kind of this golem-like creature. It was very sad and distressed, only part human. And we asked it some questions. And the most important question was, what do you really need? And it needed love, acceptance, and a sense of wholeness. And my client has an extensive pagan practice, has a lot of guides and teachers. And his guides and teachers poured or beamed this beautiful light of love, acceptance, and wholeness into and onto this creature. And he received and received and received exactly what he most deeply needed. And we stayed with this inner journey, and the creature began to transform. And ultimately it became my client as a 2-year-old child, which was the time that the abuse began. And we brought this child out of this place in historic time and into present time. And the child experienced the connection with spirit that my client has as an adult. And my client brought this child into his arms and into his body like a loving parent, welcoming him home. He doesn't need to live in that place of abuse anymore. He's in present time now. And every part of ourself holds life energy. And this child was innocent and curious, kind and intelligent. And his life energy added to the life energy of my client. And he became more whole than he had been before. Healing trauma is incredibly profound and sacred work, and it's available to all of us. Chapter 7 of my book, Allies and Demons, Working with Spirit for Power and Healing, is dedicated to transforming trauma. And there's accompanying guided audio that can guide you through that process if you want to do that work on your own. And although I have benefited greatly from the many therapists and healers in my life, I continue to do a lot of my own trauma work. And I encourage you to do the same. There are tremendous resources for healing and transformation available to all of us now. Mine is only one of many, but if you want to check it out, there's a free download for the first chapters of my book in the show notes. I'm having an informal hearing with the California Board of Psychology this week about whether I can use the term spiritual psychology. I have a feeling I can't, because even though I changed the spelling, it seems like the law states that the use of that word is misleading. I am a therapist and shamanic healer. I do not pretend to be a licensed psychologist, but I don't want to mislead anyone. And there's tons of amazing licensed psychologists out there if that's what people want to pursue. Anyway, the name of the podcast may be changing shortly, but I think the links will remain the same. So I'll keep you posted. There are plans in the work to start a free Facebook group that will include a free weekly spiritual practice. And you can check me out on Instagram at Renee McKenna. I already took the spiritual psychology off the Instagram. Blessings on your path as you make friends with your own deepest self. Until we meet again, this is Renee McKenna, wishing you well.